Good morning, everyone, and happy Thanksgiving. Have you ever seen the show Storage Wars or maybe heard of it? It's this documentary style show in which groups of people bid on these unclaimed storage units in the hopes of finding priceless treasures buried inside. In college, I worked at an engraving store slash resale shop. What we would do is engrave medals and trophies, and we would also sell used furniture and other interesting things. And our boss would bid on these storage units for things that we could resell in our store. It was not nearly as exciting as it is on the show. We didn't get to peek in beforehand or see anything like that. The units were sealed, and the participants submitted sealed bids, and whoever submitted the highest bid won the rights to whatever was inside that storage unit. One summer, our boss won a giant storage unit, the biggest storage unit available at this complex. It was so big that our boss thought there might be a car buried inside. There was not a car buried inside, not at all, but it was absolutely stuffed full. I wasn't there for the time when he bought it and opened it up, but I had heard rumors of it from my coworkers. So that Monday morning, I loaded up with one of my friends and we went to the storage unit to start working. Our job was to pick out what we could resell and to throw away what we couldn't. And I will never forget the drop in the pit of my stomach when we opened up that door for the first time. What I saw was a mountain of junk. A mountain of junk so big that we had to climb up on it to start sorting it. A mountain of junk so big that I thought our boss might be right. There might be a car buried in here somewhere. A mountain of junk so big that I thought we would never get done sorting it. The amount of junk inside of this storage unit was abundant. This week we've been talking about God's provision. Our God is a God that provides for us. God provides a solid place for us to stand. God provides us with water, even in the most unlikely of places. He sees our hunger and provides us with food and expects us to do the same for others. And today we're going to build on an idea that's been underneath the surface this whole time. We haven't called it out yet, we haven't named it, but it's been there. A couple of weeks ago, we read from Psalm 65, but we didn't read the whole thing. Let's look back at it again and pick up where we left off. Psalm 65, beginning in verse 9. You care for the land and you water it. You enrich it abundantly. The streams of God are filled with water to provide the people with grain, for so you have ordained it. You drench its furrows and you level its ridges. You soften it with showers and bless its crops. You crown the year with your bounty, and your carts overflow with abundance. The grasslands of the wilderness overflow. The hills are covered with gladness. The meadows are covered with flocks, and the valleys are mantled with grain. They shout for joy and sing. We talked about Exodus 17 and the story of God bringing water out of the rock. Listen to the way that Asaph describes this occurrence in Psalm 78. Psalm 78, beginning in verse 14. He guided them with a cloud by day and the light from the fire all night. He split the rocks in the wilderness and gave them water as abundant as the seas. He brought streams out of a rocky crag and made water flow down like rivers. Last week we talked about food, and we read from Matthew chapter 15 and the feeding of the 4,000. We read verses 29 through 37, but I specifically stopped halfway through verse 37. Let's look at it again, and we'll read that final part of that last verse. Matthew 15, beginning in verse 29. Jesus left there and went along the Sea of Galilee. Then he went up on a mountainside and sat down. Great crowds came to him, bringing the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others, and laid them at his feet, and he healed them. The people were amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled made well, the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they praised the God of Israel. Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. I do not want to send them away hungry, or they may collapse along the way. His disciples answered, Where could we get enough bread in this remote place to feed such a crowd? Jesus answered, How many loaves do you have? 7, they replied, and a few small fish. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves and the fish, and then he had given them thanks. He broke them, and he gave them to the disciples, and they in turn to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. Jesus made too much food. There was more food than this crowd of thousands could eat. Even in a crowd of so many people, there were leftovers. The food was abundant. In Psalm 65, the writer tells us that when God brings the rain, he drenches the furrows. In Psalm 78, the Asaph tells us that when God brings water out of the rock, it flows abundantly like rivers, as abundant as the seas. And in Matthew chapter 15, Matthew records that when Jesus feeds the people, there are even leftovers. When God provides abundantly. But let's go back and look at this story one more time. There are a couple of really interesting numbers in here that tell us something important. Back to Matthew 15, let's start again in verse 29 and listen for some key numbers in here. Jesus left there and went along the Sea of Galilee. Then he went up on a mountainside and sat down. Great crowds came to him, bringing the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others, and laid them at his feet. And he healed them. The people were amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled made well, the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they praised the God of Israel. Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days, and they have nothing to eat. I do not want to send them away hungry, or they may collapse along the way. His disciples answered, Where could we get enough bread in this remote place to feed such a crowd? How many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. 7, they replied, and a few small fish. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves and the fish, and when he had given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples, and they in turn to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. There's a number that appears 3 times in this story. It appears before the miracle, and it also appears after the miracle, the number 7. In Jewish culture, numbers play a little bit of a different role than they do for us. For us, numbers are measures of quantity only. In Eastern thought, though, in Jewish numerology, they also represent qualities. They have deeper meanings. And the number 7 is a really important number. It represents a few different qualities that we could translate in different ways, but they all revolve around the same idea. 7 can represent perfection. It can represent completion. It can represent fullness. It can also represent enough. Creation took 7 days because that was enough time for God to create the world. When Peter asked Jesus how many times he should forgive his brother, he says 7 times, because 7 times should be, he assumes, enough. And when Jesus asks how many loaves they have, they say 7. Jesus is standing on one side of the bread, and the disciples are standing on the other. They both see the same amount of bread. The disciples, though, see this crowd of thousands of people, and they look at this bread, and they don't see enough. They see scarcity. Jesus looks at the bread, and he sees more than enough. He sees abundance. So much abundance that after he's done feeding everyone, there are leftovers. How much is left over? 7 baskets full. The perfect amount of leftovers, a complete amount of leftovers. There was enough to feed everyone and have 7 baskets full left. When God provides, he does so abundantly. Let's go back and look at the Exodus story again for a minute, or think about it anyway. In Exodus 16, the Israelites are wandering in the desert. They're hungry and they cry out to God for food. God miraculously delivers. He rains down bread and quail from heaven. But God's blessing of food comes with one instruction: only gather enough for today. And then God covered the ground with manna and then later quail. But did God provide just enough? Once everyone had gathered their share for today, was that all there was? No. God provided more than enough. And it was up to the Israelites to take just what they needed. But the Israelites famously didn't heed those instructions. They snuck back out and they gathered more. They tried to store some for the next day. God is standing on one side of the bread, and the Israelites are standing on the other. God says, I'm giving you more than enough today, and I'll give you more than enough tomorrow. God sees abundance. The Israelites look at the same pile of food, and they see scarcity. They think, is this good enough for today? What about tomorrow? We could run out. We could become hungry again. So they stash extra. And overnight, that extra food spoils. They open it up, and it's full of mold, and it's full of maggots. God's lesson to the Israelites is a lesson in his provision. Every day I will provide, and every day I will provide more than enough. I will provide abundantly. Here's my favorite part about the feeding of the 4,000. When they're discussing how they're going to feed everyone, Jesus asks how many loaves they have. They answer 7. They had enough bread from the beginning. They don't see it yet, but they answer Jesus' question with a quality, not a quantity. Because even amongst thousands of hungry people, what they had was enough. In the hands of Jesus, 7 loaves is more than enough. Just like the Israelites and just like the disciples, we can view God's provision through a lens of scarcity. When we live in scarcity, nothing will ever be enough. The storehouses cannot ever be big enough. God cannot put enough bread on the ground to satisfy us and to make us trust in him. We can see our lives through a lens of scarcity. Or we can see our lives through a lens of abundance. When we live in abundance, we don't just see bread on the ground. We trust that it will come again tomorrow. When we live in abundance, we don't just see the loaves. We see the loaves in the hands of Jesus. In the hands of Jesus, those loaves are always enough. What we have is always enough. May we be reminded daily of the ways that God has blessed us. May we see the abundance of God's provision for us. And may we give out of that abundance to those around us. Have a great Thanksgiving, and we'll see you next week.